Thinking quickly, Lucas leapt to her, reaching for the gun before she had a chance to train it on him. She yelped in surprise, and the two fell to the ground, fighting for the weapon. Alyssa grabbed at the gun and tried to roll away, but Lucas managed to pin her arm and wrestle the gun away.
"What the fuck are you doing?"
Alyssa snarled.
"You're going to ruin everything!"
"I'm not letting you crazy bastards anywhere near me." Lucas stood up, pointing the pistol at nearby followers who had risen to investigate the commotion. He slowly backed his way towards the door as the crowd moved to clear a path for him. Alyssa leapt up and started bolting towards the door. Lucas pointed the pistol in her direction, and she stopped, throwing her hands up instinctively. "Oh, no, you don't," Lucas shouted. "All of you are just going to stay put while I—"
"You idiot!"
Alyssa shouted, moving towards him.
"I'm not with them!
I see Mr. James has already apprehended the suspect." Father Mason's voice gleefully echoed across the walls. "Bring her to me. Bring me the follower of Lude." Lucas showed his gun in confusion. Lucas lowered his gun in confusion and stepped away. Alyssa darted towards him frantically.
"Shoot me! Shoot me! Shoot me, please! Anything's better than—"
she shouted, but Lucas stepped further away, trying to make sense of the situation. The crowd converged on the two, shuffling past Lucas and towards Alyssa. She fought and kicked them away, but was soon overwhelmed by the sheer mass of people before her. She screamed and yelled obscenities at the men and women around her as they dragged her towards Father Mason. Meanwhile, Lucas received praise and pats on the back as those around him thanked him for disarming the Luddite.
"Fucking machinists!"
Alyssa screamed.
"You follow a false entity. A box of moving parts? May Lude curse all of you whores! Your machine is nothing more than that. A fucking machine. You achieve nothing but pointless death. You fucking—"
Four followers carried Alyssa by her limbs to Father Mason through the crowd, while the others stood to observe the chaos. Once there, they bound her arms and legs in a rope and tied a piece of cloth around her mouth. She bit down and attempted to scream more curses at them, but Father Mason's voice overpowered hers. "It is true. What we have before us is a follower of Lude, a filthy Luddite, come to disrupt our actions and progress. This regressive serves as a reminder that Sosatus is not without his enemies, those who would impede his purpose. Lude, brother of Sosatus and the lesser of the two, this demon, this creature, this negative force cannot be bothered to confront the infernal machine directly, so he sends his minions to do his work for him. But they meet the same fate as Lude would. They throw their lives away in a senseless attempt to turn off the machine. We will not let them. We will keep the gears turning. We will keep Sosatus satisfied." The rest of the industrial evolutionists cheered and called for the machine to be run. Alyssa struggled against her bonds as the follower on stage picked her up and carried her to the input chute. Lucas stood frozen in shock, trying to comprehend what was happening. This was his fault, wasn't it? If he hadn't... No, there's nothing he could have done. He then remembered the weapon he had held in his hand and ran towards the stage with. He pointed the pistol at Father Mason and shouted for the followers to release Alyssa. They paid him no heed and placed Alyssa in the chute as she tried to wiggle free. She looked at Lucas, her eyes wide in fear, and attempted to say something, but wasn't able to. Father Mason moved towards the crank, but Lucas kept the pistol trained on him. Father Mason stopped and grinned at Lucas. "Mr. James, excuse me, Lucas, please put that down." "What? Oh, don't look surprised. The machine tells me many things. I know who you are. I know what you're doing here, but more importantly, I know what you're going to do next. You have no part in this. You care not about the war between Sosatus and Lude. You care not about our group, nor our rivals. You see a group of cultists, and I use that term loosely. About to sacrifice, and I use that term loosely as well, a young woman to a demon machine of sorts. You play the part of the third party, the police, the hero. You wish to save her and put the rest of us behind bars. You're nothing if not noble, Lucas. But what you don't know is how Societas works. Take a look at these. He pointed to the gray patches covering his face. These are signs of strain, of wear and tear. They show that Societas uses my body as a vessel for his influence. Signs of possession, if you will. Why are you telling me this? Just remove Alyssa from the machine and... Why? Why, look at your hands, Mr. Lucas. I do find it quite beneficial that we shook hands earlier tonight. It's like the signing of a pact. Lucas kept the pistol trained on Father Mason as he pulled one of his hands closer to his face. He could see the same diseased patches that covered Father Mason's face now covered his hand and arm as well. He lowered the gun and checked his other arm as well, finding it to be covered in patches as well. He looked at Father Mason's helplessly. I don't feel right. Indeed, Lucas had felt a nauseating presence take root within his body. He stumbled and nearly fell, before bracing himself against the machine. Alyssa screamed something at him, but it was lost amidst the sudden scraping of metal and turning of gears. Steam hissed, and conveyors rattled in his skull as Lucas tried to gain his bearings. He reached out, trying to pull himself up. His hands found their way to the crank beside the machine. His vision blurred as smoke, whether real or not, obscured his sight. "Turn the crank, Lucas! Run the machine!" Father Mason's voice was the only thing Lucas could hear. It was so commanding, so imperative, so crucial, that Lucas turned the crank. He had to turn the crank. He had to turn the crank. He had to run the machine. He had to feed Societas. He had no choice. Lucas began to turn the crank. The machine roared to life, its gears spinning and its cogs grinding against each other. Steam escaped into the open air. Pistons pushed themselves upwards and downwards, and conveyor belts began to roll. There was a muffled screaming coming from the inside of the machine somewhere, but Lucas ignored it. It was essential that he kept turning the crank. After a few moments, the machine began to produce a different noise. Instead of metal pounding and scraping against metal, he could hear the metal striking a much softer surface and pressing it down with more ease. Something was caught between the cogs as they fought to keep it turning. Steam no longer hissed. A new liquid simply dripped from the pipes onto the equipment beneath. A much more revolting smell entered the warehouse. A mix of flesh, coal, and whatever other bodily fluids had been squeezed from Alyssa's penetrated. A mix of flesh, coal, and whatever other bodily fluids had been squeezed from Alyssa penetrated Lucas's nostrils. He fought off the urge to vomit and focused on turning the crank. The temperature in the entire building increased as the screams of agony slowly died off. The crank became increasingly more difficult to turn, as if Lucas was actively fighting against something in the machine. He powered through, feeling blasts of hot air around him as the sweat fell down his face. Blades spinned within the machine. Drills bored through flesh and bone, and Lucas hoped Alyssa had expired quickly, lest she feel the machine literally tear her apart. But he couldn't stop. He knew that no matter what, he had to finish turning the crank. There was a ding, and a whistle went off. The crank refused to budge, and Lucas released it. Crumpling to the floor and clasping his head, Lucas could hear distant cheering in the background, but focused on the pain inside his head. Despite not turning the crank anymore, the sounds of machinery remained, and grew louder within his mind. He could all but feel the steam flowing through his veins, the pulleys in his arms turning as he fumbled around on the floor, and the teeth of the gears pushing on the inside of his skull. A fire roared in his chest as his body consumed coal and fuel. He wanted it to stop. Oh, it needed to stop. God, why wouldn't it stop? He wasn't a machine, he was a person. A person. A person. Do you wish for it to stop, Lucas? Father Mason seemed to read his thoughts. He hadn't realized he had said those things out loud. He mumbled something under his breath that sounded like a vague yes, but wasn't sure it could be heard over the sounds of the machinery. Step into the machine, Lucas. Father Mason guided him gently. Yes, yes. That was where he needed to go. Into the bigger machine. He was a machine too, right? It made sense to give his parts to the larger machine. It needed to complete its purpose after all. Fuel, fuel, fuel. It needed fuel. He was fuel, right? He could already feel the machine inside him. The gray spots on his arms were markings, marking him as a machine. He was defective. He needed to upgrade. He didn't want to be obsolete. He stepped into the chute and waited. Nothing happened. He needed to turn the crank, but he couldn't. A human needed to. And he was no longer human. Easy, Lucas. You'll be with Sosatus soon enough. That sounded perfect. Sosatus would understand him, would shelter him, would cater to his needs. After all, he was a machine too. They were perfect for one another. I'm impressed, Lucas, Father Mason said as he took his place beside the crank. Most people go insane after a possession, but not you. You are very strong-willed, and you have a place with Sosatus. What you don't know, Lucas, is that the machine isn't Sosatus. This is the delivery chute. He's more glorious than you can imagine. Hail Sosatus, the infernal machine! His words were repeated by the other humans in the room, but not Lucas. Lucas braced for the embrace of Sosatus. As Father Mason turned the crank, Lucas slid down beneath the machine and caught a glimpse of the true entirety of Sosatus. The Sosatus machine stretched on for miles beneath the earth, filled to the brim with moving parts and machinery. Bits of flesh clung to it, and it almost seemed sentient. It breathed between the gears. It could see him between the gears. It talked to him between the gears. But Lucas knew better. It was nothing more than a machine. It couldn't have been alive. Lucas knew he was important, that he would keep the machine running, ensuring it fulfilled its purpose, whatever that might be. Before Lucas spent hours being processed through the entirety of the device, he agreed with Father Mason. It was more glorious than he could have imagined. By whitix. This pasta kind of reminds me of an SCP story. There's too many of them for me to narrow which one I'm thinking of in particular. There's definitely a factory, and I'm not even going to get started on the SCP stuff. I thought that was, a very cool story. And just as a side note, if you like cults and or industrial complexes, you should check out my Junketsu series on this channel. It's got both those things and a whole lot more stuff too. So, shameless plug right there. Thanks for sticking around, if indeed you still are, guys. Stay tuned for more, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye!